Imagine stepping into the heart of Rome at its most decadent hour. The air is thick with incense, the glow of torches paints the marble walls in flickering gold, and somewhere in the distance, laughter mixes uneasily with screams. This is not the Rome of noble senators and stoic philosophers. This is the Rome of Caligula, the emperor who turned the empire's greatest palaces into theaters of humiliation, desire, and dread. What happens when absolute power is combined with unchecked desire? When one man, crowned by both tradition and fear, believes himself a living god with no boundaries? The answer is not simply cruelty, it is terror disguised as pleasure, humiliation paraded as entertainment, and domination masked as divinity. Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, is remembered as one of Rome's most infamous rulers. His reign, though brief, from 37 to 41 CE, has become synonymous with madness, sadism, and excess. Ancient writers like Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Josephus describe an emperor who indulged not only in bloodshed, but in acts that defied the moral codes of Rome itself. Yet, we must tread carefully. These accounts, written largely by hostile senators and later historians, may be colored by bias, exaggeration, and political agendas. Still, the patterns of cruelty are too consistent, too haunting to dismiss entirely. In this episode, we peel back the veil of imperial propaganda and whispered rumor. We confront the most terrifying sexual practices attributed to Caligula, practices that turned intimacy into a weapon, family into victims, and Rome itself into an unwilling stage. This will challenge everything you thought you knew about Rome's golden age. What follows is not a celebration, but a condemnation, a reminder of how quickly power, left unchecked, can erode humanity. Stay with us as we journey into the shadows of the Palatine Hill to uncover the hidden truths Rome tried to bury and the scars that remain when cruelty masquerades as desire. In the year 37 CE was a city hungry for change. For nearly 2 decades, it had suffered under the dark and paranoid reign of Emperor Tiberius, a ruler who retreated into isolation on the island of Capri, where rumors swirled of grotesque excess and cruel executions. The Senate was weary, the people restless. When news came that Tiberius was dead, the city exhaled a collective sigh of relief. All eyes turned to his successor, the young Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, better known as Caligula. At first, hope bloomed. Caligula was the son of Germanicus, a beloved general whose early death left the Roman people mourning a hero. The boy had grown up in military camps, earning the affectionate nickname Caligula, or Little Boot, from the soldiers who doted on him. To many, he represented a chance for renewal, a return to the glory days of Augustus. In those early months, Caligula delivered. He showered the people with gifts, abolished unpopular taxes, and staged grand spectacles in the arenas. Banquets spilled across marble courtyards, perfumed oils scented the air, and the streets echoed with cheers as Rome celebrated the arrival of an emperor who seemed both youthful and generous. Senators whispered approval, relief washing through the Senate chambers, where fear had long lingered, but the glitter of this new reign soon began to tarnish. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe a turning point after Caligula fell gravely ill just months into his rule. When he recovered, he was no longer the adored young prince. Instead, his behavior grew erratic, paranoid, and increasingly cruel. Josephus, writing later, emphasized how the emperor's megalomania and obsession with divine status turned Rome's admiration into terror. The same halls that once smelled of incense and wine soon reeked of fear. Banquets became stages for humiliation, and rumors of the emperor's twisted appetites began to ripple through the city like poison in water. Senators learned to speak carefully, for even a glance could mean disgrace. Or worse. Rome had long endured emperors who abused their power. But in Caligula, the empire would witness something darker. the merging of absolute authority with desires that knew no boundaries. To understand the terrors of Caligula's reign, we must first step into the shadows of his childhood, a world steeped in blood, betrayal, and fear. Caligula was born into the glittering but dangerous heart of Rome's imperial family. His father, Germanicus, was adored by the people but died suddenly, possibly poisoned on the orders of Emperor Tiberius. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, fell victim to exile and starvation after clashing with the ruling power. Two of his brothers were executed. By the time he reached adulthood, Caligula had already seen his family torn apart by politics and paranoia. Taken under the wing of Tiberius, Caligula spent years on the island of Capri, a place rumored by ancient sources to be a stage for the emperor's cruelty and perverse excesses. Whether embellished or not, Suetonius and Tacitus both describe Capri as a prison of pleasure and fear, where young Gaius learned that survival meant silence, obedience, and a careful mask of charm. These years etched into him a twisted lesson: that power was inseparable from humiliation, that control was maintained not by kindness, but by domination. When Caligula finally ascended the throne, the scars of these experiences shaped him. Suetonius recounts how he delighted in mocking traditions, blurring the lines between sacred and profane. Early whispers suggested a troubling fascination with his sisters, especially Drusilla, whom he reportedly treated as both confidant and consort. Cassius Dio paints him as a man obsessed with testing boundaries, turning intimacy into a stage for power, and making Rome itself complicit in his defiance of morality. It is crucial to acknowledge the bias of our sources. Much of what survives was written by senators who despised Caligula and had every incentive to portray him as monstrous. Yet across multiple accounts, certain patterns remain too consistent to ignore: his paranoia, his god complex, and his use of sexuality not for pleasure alone, but as a weapon of humiliation. The origins of his horror, then, were not sudden. They were cultivated in the crucible of fear, sharpened by trauma, and unleashed upon an empire unprepared for the storm. Rome thought it had gained a savior. Instead, it had raised a man who mistook cruelty for divinity. Once Caligula secured Rome's throne, the palace ceased to be a sanctuary of statecraft and became something darker, a gilded cage of humiliation and fear. The marble corridors of the Palatine Hill echoed not with statesmanship, but with whispers of coercion, betrayal, and perverse displays of power. What had once been Rome's beating political heart now pulsed with dread. According to Suetonius in the 12 Caesars, Caligula blurred the boundaries between private vice and public spectacle. He is said to have committed incest with his sisters, Agrippina, Livilla, and most notoriously, Drusilla. Suetonius claims he paraded Drusilla openly as his consort, even treating her as Rome's unofficial empress. Cassius Dio expands on these accounts, describing Caligula's obsession with testing taboos and flaunting his control by making sacred family ties instruments of scandal. Whether entirely true or shaped by senatorial malice, the message was clear: no Roman, not even those bound by blood, could escape his grasp. But Caligula's appetite extended beyond his family. Senators, the very men who had once celebrated his rise, found themselves humiliated through their wives. Ancient sources describe how the emperor would invite high-ranking officials to banquets, only to seize their wives before their eyes, boasting afterward of his conquest as if it were a political triumph. For Caligula, sexuality was not intimacy, it was strategy. By violating the sanctity of marriage, he emasculated Rome's elite, reminding them that even their most private bonds were subject to his power. Imagine the atmosphere: candlelight, flickering against frescoed walls, the air heavy with perfumes, masking the stench of fear. Laughter forced, eyes averted, as senators sat powerless, while their emperor transformed desire into a weapon of domination. To refuse was unthinkable, to object was suicidal. Every banquet became a test of submission, every invitation a threat. Whispers suggest he transformed parts of the palace into a brothel, where noblewomen were forced to serve, blurring the line between empire and theatre of shame. Though archaeology offers little direct proof, the consistency of accounts from Suetonius, Dio, and later chroniclers hints at a systematic pattern rather than isolated rumor. In Caligula's Rome, sexuality was no longer personal. It was political, an empire held hostage by the emperor's desires. At the height of his madness, Caligula's palace no longer resembled a seat of governance. It became a stage where humiliation was ritual and desire was weaponized as theater. Ancient sources describe the most shocking transformation. Entire wings of the imperial palace were turned into a brothel, staffed not by slaves or courtesans, but by Rome's own noblewomen and wives of senators. Behind the golden doors of the Palatine, marble columns and silk draperies framed a spectacle of degradation where Rome's elite were forced to serve the whims of their emperor. Suetonius recounts how Caligula would parade these women publicly, pointing them out by name, advertising their supposed charms, as though the empire's nobility were little more than merchandise. Cassius Dio echoes this, noting that the emperor treated sexuality as a marketplace of power, where humiliation was currency. To the emperor, these acts were not indulgence, they were performance. Every conquest, every forced display was proof that no law, no tradition, no moral barrier could bind him. Caligula even demanded worship of his own body, positioning himself as a living god. Temples were rededicated in his honor, and citizens were coerced to kneel before him, blurring the line between religion and submission. In this world, sex was stripped of intimacy and recast as sacrament to the emperor's divinity. Victims, wives, sisters, citizens, became unwilling participants in a grotesque ritual where silence was survival and shame was eternal. Imagine the fear, eyes lowered, voices hushed, knowing that resistance meant ruin, yet compliance meant degradation. Why did Rome tolerate this? Partly because of terror, but partly because divinity shielded him. To challenge Caligula was to challenge a god. And so senators endured their humiliation, noblewomen bore their shame, and society cloaked its disgust beneath the language of reverence. In reflecting on these horrors, one sees a disturbing pattern echoed across history. When leaders are elevated beyond accountability, when power is mistaken for divinity, humanity itself becomes expendable. Caligula's Rome is distant, but the warning it offers remains immediate. An empire bowed not out of loyalty, but out of fear, fear sanctified in the name of godhood. By the year 41 CE, Rome's patience had fractured. Caligula's reign had become unbearable, not only because of financial ruin or political chaos, but because of the relentless humiliation inflicted upon the empire's most powerful families. Senators who once held dignity in Rome's halls now lived in fear of public degradation, their wives and daughters reduced to pawns in the emperor's theatre of shame. For many, assassination became less an act of rebellion and more an act of survival. The blow came suddenly. Caligula was cut down by members of his own Praetorian Guard, stabbed repeatedly in the corridors of the palace he had turned into a brothel. Blood pooled where incense once burned. To those who struck the fatal blows, it was not merely vengeance for tyranny. It was liberation from the constant dishonor he inflicted upon Rome's ruling class. In the aftermath, the Senate attempted to erase him. Statues were destroyed, inscriptions scratched away, and official records purged. Yet, as often happens, erasure only amplified the whispers. Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing with senatorial biases, painted Caligula as the very image of depravity, ensuring his infamy would outlast his monuments. The truth is difficult to untangle. Were the tales of incest, forced prostitution, and divine arrogance exaggerated by political enemies? Almost certainly some were. But when so many independent accounts repeat the same patterns of cruelty, one must wonder, are they inventions or fragments of truth too horrific to deny. Caligula's body was destroyed, but his shadow lingered, a stain on Rome's memory, a reminder of the perils of unchecked power. Caligula's reign endures as one of history's starkest warnings. When leaders come to see themselves as gods, humanity is the first casualty. His brief but brutal rule demonstrates how power, when severed from accountability, corrodes not only the ruler, but the society that bends beneath him. In Caligula's Rome, intimacy became spectacle, faith became obedience, and terror became routine. The empire survived his fall, but the scars of his tyranny lingered like smoke long after the fire was gone. Even today, whispers of Rome's darkest chapters echo in our conversations about absolute power. We speak of dictators who demand worship, leaders who humiliate rather than guide, regimes that transform fear into loyalty. The details may change, but the pattern is hauntingly familiar. Unchecked authority breeds cruelty, and cruelty cloaked in divinity becomes almost impossible to resist. Caligula's Rome reminds us that silence in the face of abuse is complicity, and that empires collapse not only from external enemies, but from rot within. Yet history is never simple. Our knowledge of Caligula comes filtered through the pens of senators who despised him, chroniclers who sought to moralize his downfall, and storytellers who thrived on scandal. Propaganda and truth intertwine, forcing us to question how much is slander and how much is too horrific to fabricate. Perhaps the very exaggerations are a testament to his infamy, when even lies cannot outpace the reality of his terror. In the end, the survival of these stories is itself a warning. Rome tried to bury his memory, but history refused. Truth, no matter how distorted, has a way of enduring and reminding us what happens when power no longer remembers its limits. The palace that once rang with forced laughter and whispered dread fell silent on the day Caligula's body struck the marble floor. The torches flickered in corridors still perfumed with incense, but for the first time in years, the shadows no longer bent to his will. Where humiliation had been ritual, there was only quiet. Where Rome's nobility once trembled under his gaze, there was relief, mingled with disbelief that the nightmare had finally ended. But silence does not erase memory. Caligula's reign stands as a chilling reminder of how swiftly unchecked power devours humanity. Cruelty disguised as pleasure, sacred ties violated for spectacle, dignity crushed beneath the weight of one man's obsessions. This was the true legacy of an emperor who mistook himself for a god. He ruled for less than 4 years, yet the scars he left on Rome have echoed for centuries. And here we must turn to ourselves. Which of Caligula's acts disturbs you most? The incestuous displays, the public humiliations, the transformation of a palace into a brothel? Or is it the silence of those who endured, the complicity born of fear that lingers more hauntingly? What does it tell us about power today, when leaders place themselves above law, above morality, above humanity itself? This story is not told to sensationalize nor to glorify, but to condemn. History forces us to confront what we wish to forget, not to revel in the horror, but to learn from it. These events, however distorted by propaganda or rumor, are reminders of the dangers when authority loses its limits. If this journey into Rome's darkest shadows has left you with questions, share them. Comment below with your thoughts. Which lessons do you think history is warning us about most urgently? And if you believe these stories must not be lost, help us keep history alive. Like, subscribe, and walk with us again into the forgotten corners of the past. Rome remembers, even when the stones refuse to speak.